Good morning, everyone, and I'm happy to be here. As with even hourly, I'm really expecting an interesting day, and I'm Markku Wilenius, Professor of Future Studies in Turku School of Economics and Director of Finland Futures Research Centre. And this is very exciting, this topic of our seminar, complexity research and futures research. Well, I think at least the theme is complex enough for us to allow fruitful discussions on how to interpret complex systems, complex world, and how do we intervene organizations and processes that are complex. And last but not least, how do we make our businesses to work better together in this world of complex systems? Before going into the subject matter, I would like to say something about our center, because there might be some of you who don't know what we are fiddling with. Obviously, we have to have a mission, and our mission is to be a basis for multi-disciplinary studies, research, education, different training systems, consultations. And above that, I think that if there is one concept that we have in mind is that that we want to all approach from different directions is the idea of a sustainable futures. So everything that we do should be related to the idea of sustainability. We do have, of course, different emphases in our activities, and here you might get some idea of our spearheads, so to say, in our activities. And as a result of some research traditions, we do have lots of research concerning environment from different points of view, visionary leadership, creativity, and different sorts of cultural studies. But this is just this doesn't, cover everything. And besides, as I said, we have different educational concepts. Next year we're going to launch master programs for future studies, which is the second in the world, as we know it. Foresight is of course top of that. The foresight again relates our activities to the different methodologies, and we also want to take care of our basic research. So when Eve was yesterday in our little group, was expressing the idea of working as research-based consultancy. Maybe we have a similar kind of idea here, so that we have this kind of extension of where we see that we have to do research, but we also have to have ways to apply that research to the world. So that much about it. Then some numbers. We have very different clients. We have very different sources of our funding, as you see from that. But I'm not going much into that. There has been a steady increase of our activities, which is of course somehow reflected in our amount of personnel. And of course the projects are also being increasing, and some of you might see some S-curve taking place of that. I don't know if that's a S-curve, but anyway, it always happens, and I think this is the part of our discussion today, that if there is a very rapid growth, there must also come a more steadier phase. Okay, I would like to pose you with 4 approaches or views on this subject matter today. And the first idea is the idea of the network society, which is the kind of approach that I personally found the first real aspect of how we understand the formation of our social activities. And then I have to there relate to the works of Manuel Castas, because it was such a tremendous impact that I think he made on social research. And here when we talk about are we heading towards the network society or knowledge society or information society, I think I would love to prefer this idea of the network society, and I give you some reasons. What Castells saw is that it is about three historical processes stemming from revolution of technology, restructuring of economy, and the critique of culture, which have later converged in various manners that have brought about globalized informational society, a novel, a kind of a very venerable trinity of production, power, and human experience, where networking have become a dominant form of social organization. Now, this dominant form of social organization is something that is at the core of this idea. In this new setting, the production, processing, and transmission of information become essential means for economic success, political legitimacy, and cultural influence. Now, in his very recent book, he had this trilogy that he produced in the end of the 90s, and just a couple of months ago came out another called Network Society. He made it with some colleagues, and there he writes, and this is adding up something that he has been working on formally. Networks became the most efficient organizational form as a result of three major features of networks that benefited from the new technological environment: flexibility, scalability, and survivability. Flexibility, because networks can reconfigure according to changing environments, keeping their goals while changing their components. They go around blocking points in communication channels to find new connections. Scalability, because they can shrink or expand in size with little disruption. And survivability, because they have no center and can operate in wide range of configurations. Networks can resist attack on their noxes and codes because the codes of the networks are contained in the multiple nodes that can reproduce the instructions and find new ways to perform. So only physical ability to destroy the connecting points can eliminate the network. What I like to stress here, and I think here I depart somewhat from Castells' thoughts, is that what we are witnessing here is the emergence of network society, and not as yet the network society itself. What we are seeing predominantly in the practices of organization is still direct heritage of industrial society. And the essential values and practices of Fordism and Taylorism are still holding us way, harnessing the imagination and the power of sensing in the businesses around the world and confining them to prisoners to the worldview of industrial capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff and James Maxim have pointed out in their very, very brilliant work on support economy. I recommend that. But in the long run and in the future, what we are about to see is the inevitable turn of the paradigm, the shift from industrial society to network society, and not, as some people claim, to knowledge society. And this is because the information flows and the information technology is nothing but manure, which help the network society to ripe, to come into existence. But it is awfully crude mistake to interpret them to be essence of the emerging economic and social system. So, it is manure in the same way as the invention of artificial manures in the 19th century helped agriculture and agricultural society to increase productivity. But it is also, I feel, justified to call our present interim area as information society, since increasing flows on information and sharing of knowledge are indeed the drivers of the change. To sum up my first comment on the theme of our seminar, I would like to pose you with a Castell's notion again on culture of network society. The culture of global network society is a culture of protocols of communication, enabling communication between different cultures on the basis not necessarily of shared values, but of sharing value of communication. See the difference? That means that the new culture is not made of content, but of process. It is a culture of communication for the sake of communication. It is an open-ended network of cultural meanings that can not only coexist, but also interact and modify each other on the basis of this exchange. In my second comment, I would like to endeavour to relate this topic to my own recent research on the theme of this conference. In my book, published half a year ago, called Towards Creative Economy, Cultural Competence as Futures Resource, unfortunately only in Finnish for the time being, but in the process of being translated. I tried to investigate new, fundamentally cultural sources of competitiveness as a response to heavily ongoing debate on fortifying division of labour in our globalizing societies. Now, one of the offspring of the public discussion that I and some of my colleagues were able to engender is the topic of creative capital and the challenge of leadership in our business world. In my limited capacity of understanding the issue, this brings me back to discussions of immaterial of intellectual capital, talking in terms of innovations, customized organizational structures and employee practices in our corporate world. Researchers like Baruch Liu and Leif Edvinsson have already pointed out the fact that in some instances no less than 80% of the company value is derived from the capital of this sort, be it the brand value, reputation, patents, leadership systems, etc. While our methods of making this capital tangible are still very much in its infancy, thus preventing us from tapping these resources in the optimal manner. What I do find is that the greatest challenge of cooperation is to connect the creativity to leadership and furthermore connecting leadership to innovation processes of the company. As I see it, most corporations are still managed and led like, for instance, a sausage factory, where the most important strategic intent of the corporation is to produce sausage with stable quality and with lowest possible production costs. It is existing production that dictates the processes aimed at the strategic development and perception of the new possibilities. It is evident that the quarter capitalism, as we call it, has tremendously reinforced this lack of vision. Countless possibilities to develop the operations of the company are cast away because the executives of the companies do not possess insight on how creativity, the discovery of the new and fresh innovations, be they technological or social by their nature, are channeled to the everyday life of the corporations. The question is not how to control the creative capital, but how to channel it, thus leading us to appreciate the processes whereby different, even conflicting views are treated and processed in a constructive way and not hidden in the coffee table discussions or into X-files of the corporate executives. Now, the third aspect I want to touch upon derives directly from my previous remarks, as it has to do with the learning, interaction and our understanding of the complex adaptive systems, or talking about human systems, complex evolving systems, as Eve yesterday pointed out. As my distinguished colleague Esko Kilpi, somewhere here, or there in the background, who has worked with these issues for such many years with transnational companies, has pointed out, when organizations are facing the growing complexity, they start to ask how we are supposed to manage all this. Our chaos and immense complexity, coherence and novelty can emerge only if previously fragmented information and compartmentalized people are connected. And this calls for organizational learning. To put it straight, we need genuine conversation and listening. We need to be able to create a common context and not necessarily common values or consensus. As a result, we should have new ways of seeing things. Seeing things anew calls for our understanding of complexity science and complex evolving systems. As Professor Eve Mitleton-Kelly so persuasively pointed out yesterday, as I already told in our session with corporate people, we should indeed see corporates as complex evolving systems that increasingly derive their existence, strength and ultimate success from the multiple patterns of interaction, or using the language of complexity science, from attractors. Now the point here is that we have attractors that are limited, stuck to a fixed point and periodic, as Esko Kilpi has turned out, shown. If we live in such a situation, no novelty or new thinking can emerge within organization. We simply get stuck with our or they thinking patterns. In other words, with our sense-making processes. What we need are flexible and open attractors that produce new thinking and consistency within our organizations. The success or the failure of the organizations ultimately rests on their capacity to engender dynamic and flexible attractors that are the fundamental platforms of creative capital. Now, the fourth and the last view on the theme of our seminar stems from my acquaintance with Club of Rome, which I'm proud to be a member. So please forgive me to deliver a little bit of Club of Rome propaganda. Club of Rome is determined to promote long-term thinking for the humanity and for our natural system that we are essentially a part of. And exactly 1 month ago, we hosted here a meeting, an annual conference on the Club of Rome. And I think that we were, to some extent, able to plant a couple of seeds of Club of Rome thinking to the Finnish soil of political economic thinking. Now, in our meeting, the 30-year update report of the famous Limits to Growth report, produced by the same authors, by the way, that did the original research some 30 years ago, was discussed. The most used concept in that session was overshoot. Overshoot means to go too far, to go beyond the limits accidentally, without intention. And as pointed out in that report, there are three causes of the overshoot that are always the same at any scale from personal to planetary. First, there is a growth, acceleration and rapid change. Second, there is some form of limit or barrier beyond which the moving system may not safely go. Third, there is a delay or mistake in the perceptions and responses that strive to keep the system within its limits. These three are necessary and sufficient to produce an overshoot. Now what has happened is that the ecological footprint of human action, the land and the natural resources consumed by population of various nations, has from 80s on overshot the planetary capacity to regenerate these resources. And this is one of the graph of that recent study. In other words, the ecological footprint of global society, that of human system, has overshot the Earth's capacity to provide, and we have already begun to see the consequences of this overshoot. The potential consequences of this overshoot are profoundly dangerous, as we apparently all understand. The situation is in many ways unique. It confronts the humanity with issues never before experienced by our species in global scale. And unfortunately, for all our development as modernized societies, we lack perspectives, we lack cultural norms, we lack habits and the institutions required to cope with this systemic overshoot. And according to all the information that we have indeed a very little time. But we do not have to feel helpless with this situation. What we do have is the capacity to learn, and I think this is what we are here for. We have to recognize ourselves as complex, evolving systems that can make a deliberate turnaround and correct the system, first in our heads and then in our actions. So let's learn how this system really works. So once again I would like to welcome you on my behalf, on behalf of Futures Research Centre, to this seminar, Be It Fruitful. Thank you.